Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Just Transition platform on the just transition of carbon-intensive regions, a transatlantic dialogue. The Just Transition mechanism and the Just Transition Fund were set up to address the socio-economic consequences of the climate transition. And what do we know about this transition? Well, we know it will be challenging. We have set out commitments over the next 30 years, which will be very demanding. We know it will be uncertain, and we also know it will be diverse. And it's that diversity today that is the focus for our discussion. And in particular, the needs of carbon-intensive sectors. And the discussion today will focus on a very important carbon-intensive sector, that is to say, of steel. And I said, at the start that there is uncertainty and there is challenge ahead of us. And in order to address these challenges, we need to try and bring our knowledge together to understand what has been done in the past, how we have addressed the technical challenges of a changing sector or changing sectors, but also the socioeconomic consequences in different places. And one of the best ways we can do that is to bring together experts from across the world who are working on these issues, who have had experience in the transformations that they bring, and also reflecting on how we can approach it in the future. And I'm really delighted today to bring together speakers from both sides of the Atlantic, from two large geopolitical entities which have set out strong commitments in relation to climate change ambitions. I'm sure everybody has been talking about COP26, but this really just shows us the urgency of what we have to do and the need, as I said earlier, to capitalize on the resources, the knowledge we have. We have people from both sides of the Atlantic. And our hope today, in the context of the work on the platform, is to start a dialogue, to start a transatlantic dialogue of a community of interest whose objective is to share solutions about accelerating and addressing the socioeconomic challenges of these difficult processes that lie ahead of us. As I said, I'm really happy to have four very knowledgeable speakers with us today. So starting in the US, we have Ray Gastel, who's director at the Remaking Cities Institute in the US, and is not only an academic, a researcher, teacher, but also has had experience in Pittsburgh city administration, a city which has transformed itself over the last years, and of course is synonymous with the steel industry. We have Erika Bergland-Aas from the IF Metall in Sweden, who is responsible for research on climate and environment. We have Tamara Korchenko, who is professor at the University of Victoria in Canada and focuses on economic and industrial transition issues. And finally, we have Sebastian Schlecht, who is a strategic manager for environment, climate and mobility, and the European Green Capital in the city of Essen, and will bring the knowledge from his experience there to once again another one of Europe's big steelmaking centers. So today's session will be built around a set of presentations. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present, and then we will have a good 20 to 30 minutes for questions and discussion to bring in the speakers. And I would very much encourage you to use Swapcard to ask questions both during the presentation and later on to give us feedback, and we will collate them and feed them back to the speakers. That's the basis for the discussion. And then in order to close, I have my colleague Vladimir Zuberek from DG Klima, who works on the international dimension of climate policy, who will wrap the session up. So without any further ado, I pass the floor to Ray. Ray, I look very much forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. As said, my name is Ray Gastel. I direct the Remaking Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon University in the School of Architecture and with other departments and schools. I worked with the city of Pittsburgh for a number of years as city planning director, and I came to Pittsburgh after living in a number of other regions in the United States. And it's a fascinating region because in many ways, some of its work has been done in terms of transitioning from a carbon-intensive economy, certainly within the city boundaries. Yet at the same time, there's a great deal more work to do, and the legacy of that carbon-intensive industry is still very much part of Pittsburgh within its boundaries as well as the region. So one of the things we do with the Remaking Cities Institute is look at this in an international context, which is why I'm so pleased to be part of this transatlantic dialogue. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you something that I think is critical to understand a little bit. We're starting with the first one, which is just the introduction, but then if we move on to the next slide, we can see a compare and contrast, which you're seeing a portion of it. It's you can see the Pittsburgh 1906 and Pittsburgh 2016, basically 110 years difference. This one is not particularly heavy on the steel mills, it's particularly heavy on the coal transport, just so that you can see that at the very heart of the city, the exact same place where there would be hotels and recreation and sports stadiums and all these other developments that happened, and largely in the last 30 years, some of the buildings older because it was a downtown center as well. And I'm showing this because it was, for so long, Pittsburgh was known as the Smoky City. Many people still assume it is the Smoky City. It hasn't been the Smoky City for quite some time, really since the 40s, in fact. And that was a transition from coal, not in industry, but in residential heating. But I show this to you just to kind of give a sense of it. You can't really see the scale here, but Pittsburgh was a center of industry like the Ruhrgebiet. I mean, it was at that scale or even larger in terms of the amount of iron and steel production, as well as earlier industries of glass and then also aluminum. So if we go on and we look at this, we see a change, and it's a sort of common story of the post-industrial city. It was carbon intensive, it was manufacturing. Now it has stadiums and recreation, and also, though you can't really read it, you're looking at a cultural district in the foreground. So how did this happen? So let's look at the next slide, and I'll show you a little bit about how this happened. What happened was that there was a complete collapse of steel that sort of really is sort of done. It sort of starts in the 70s, and it's a rolling kind of situation due to all sorts of international and other forces that have sort of like made the steel industry no longer viable. And so it goes, the city of Pittsburgh, or the region really, is at unemployment levels at the level of the Great Depression from the 1930s. It's sort of the sort of striking figures. More people left Pittsburgh in the 70s, 80s, 90s than left New Orleans after the hurricane. It was, and then there's 3 decades of population decline. So the city is really at a nadir of a kind in 1985, although ironically that same year it wins a livability award in terms of a quality of life assessment. We'll talk about that. When we look at the next slide, we can see, because a great deal of work was what happened in the mid-'80s in response to this. A great deal of work, Pittsburgh's often cited as this great miraculous return from an earlier economy. Well, it was 30 years in the making. There was a combined cultural, private, foundation, all kinds of entities, university, of course, worked together on these entities like the Cultural District, a Strategy 21, 10 years later, working together, the creation of a Regional Asset District, which distributed government funds to cultural and park and sort of quality of life assets. And then the sort of ongoing strategy for education, planning, and investment throughout all those decades, including, on a site basis, things that are not minor at all, that you change the insurance regulations on a brownfield site, and all of a sudden these huge steel sites could be redeveloped because the liability had changed for them. If we go to the next slide, I think we can see a little bit more of this, which is here we're looking on the left at Hazelwood, which is where a major steel and coke plant was. Iron really and coke production on the Monongahela. And then here's the vision for it for Hazelwood Green, which was created in about 2018 and passed and went through the planning process and so forth, and now is active and is building. I mean, not at this scale yet. They don't have that many tenants and occupants, but we'll show you a little bit of that. But the point is that the city industry was in the heart of the city, and that's largely changed. However, its legacy in the region and its role in the region and the kind of return and the change that Pittsburgh has seen has not been shared evenly. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that this happened, but that vision that was building this was based, it was in many ways a sort of new economy of technology. And this is the Robotics Center, which is literally taking an old steel foundry and turning it into a center for robotics research, one of the leading ones in the nation. If we go to the next slide, you can see a kind of a rundown just looking at the AV industry. Well, this is a little before that. This is noting another transformation of a building, which is a steel industry structure, which is in Hazelwood Green, that one that I showed you that image of before, in which the steel shell has been retained. It's got solar array on the roof, and then it has a sort of new park by award-winning designers in front of us. And then inside it is the advanced robotics manufacturing and other similar industries, which are part of a new not emerging anymore, but really a prevalent and successful tech industry. Come to the next slide. We can just sort of run this down. I'm just sort of giving you some examples of all the work, from this Terragator, the sort of the first AV in a certain way, and then moving on through how that's become part of the industry and activity in the economy of Pittsburgh. If we go to the next slide. This is just, you can't see it as well as one might, but if I were to draw a circle with over the top of that building, you'll see that building, which was the U.S. Steel Tower, is now the UPMC Tower, which is the UPMC Tower being a medical entity. And if there isn't a more iconic symbol of a sort of moving to eds and meds from a manufacturing economy than that, it would be hard to find one. And this is also on a site which was is the Hill, which is now, after years of being a kind of a really unfortunate and unfair condition of urban renewal, is now finally being rebuilt today. So next slide. So the challenges and opportunities that we have, there's ongoing challenges. One is that there's communities left behind. This is work that Don Carter, my colleague, who many of you know from his work on post-industrial cities, is working on in terms of a new course and new activities at CMU. There's also the sort of carbon-intensive legacy that there are still many brownfield sites. There are still many sites where the only jobs were industry, which are still sort of transitioning, trying to find new economic opportunities. And then there's also something, not unlike other parts of the world, there really is a second wave of a carbon-intensive economy, which is we don't kind of get into in this, but it is something to consider. Next. So I'm just going to show you one image of history of this corridor systems and centers. We'll go on a moment. And if we look at the next image, this is just a historic map, 1906, that same year that I was talking about when you saw the sort of the coal barges, which incidentally, there are still coal barges running through Pittsburgh. They just tend not to dock there anymore. We are the second largest inland port in the United States, or in North America, largely through the transmission of those, because it's a legacy that's in some ways still with us in a variety of ways. But this is just to give you the sense that this was a regional system, much more than the city of Pittsburgh, connected by a huge infrastructure, which in many ways is still there, in some cases still serving some of these industries, in other cases a legacy and a redundant system. If we go to the next slide, we can just see this sort of that we are, as I said, a system of rivers, corridors, regions, centers, but these corridors are prevalent and they remain industrial, or they remain industrial legacy. And what happens with them and how they become places that are not left behind, but places that are included in the new economy is work that we're all part of. Next slide, thank you. And this is just under construction now a couple years back, because it's much more finished now, but this is an enormous fracking plant which uses the resources from the unconventional gas, which is fracking in the region. But this is known as the cracker plant, with the Shell investment. So, but that's just this, that there is a second wave of carbon-intensive economy, but it's a little bit different story, and hopefully this story that can be shaped and influenced by a larger vision for a green and less carbon-intensive future for the region. Next. Thank you. So I'm going to just look at the different scales, because we need to kind of just run through this briefly. So at this scale, if we look at the next slide, we can see a little bit about that. this is one which is at the largest scale, really, other than national. This is a vision. It was first announced in fall 2020. Now it's been sort of re-announced in fall 2021. Mayor Peduto, the mayor who will be mayor through the end of the year in Pittsburgh, is a leader in this. But it's a vision with 4 states of the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania, in which it really imagines of more than $1 trillion being sort of pulled together as assets and sort of developing a cleaner and greener economy, and one that would ultimately create 400,000 jobs. There is reason to think that aspects of this is not official government policy at this time. It has some political and private and even labor interest and excitement about it. And we do have presumably the full passage of the various Biden-Harris administration sort of infrastructure work, which could potentially help fund this. But it's a vision of how we could actually pull together, and in terms of like not just at the scale of the Pittsburgh region or not just the scale of Western Pennsylvania, but really recognize this as something at a kind of sub-regional, almost national scale. And I'll show you a couple of other images to talk about this. I'm talking about there are some existing frameworks, such as we do have, as in the next slide, you'll see that we have we do have a climate action plan at the state level. We also have a climate action plan at the city level, which has more teeth and more enforcement capacities in it in terms of a transitioning and reduction of carbon gas emissions, and also trying to get the training and the capacity for an economy which doesn't leave communities behind, whether those are communities actually within municipal centers, which are, or whether it's ones that are sort of physically isolated from this new economy. And if we look at the next slide, we can see some of the ways we're trying to make sure that that's validated. And as we work on this, when we talk about United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, that they are actually connected to the work that is done with communities. And that's a critical part of that Marshall Plan vision as well, so if we go to the next slide, just to give you kind of a graphic that was developed in the city of Pittsburgh on working in a sort of eco-district model, and how we really did, none of this will work unless we can actually convince people at a local level, not just within the city of Pittsburgh, but also regionally, that they have a stake in this greener economy. And just like the work that's being done on the Just Transition platform and the mechanism, this is very much part of the work. And this goes on, and this is done at the county level, the city level, et cetera, and it is already part of the work that's done also at the state level. But whether we get as far as we'd like to go will depend on things, whether concepts like the Marshall Plan are able to be fully advanced. And that's why I'm interested in the current work of the fellow speakers, as well as the past work. Thank you very much. Peter, I believe you're muted.
I'm sorry. Sorry. So you missed me thanking you, Ray. I thought really a great presentation to kick us off with, and I think which really sets us up very nicely. Now, can we move on to Elika for her presentation? Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me here today. I work as a research officer, as you said, at IF Metall, a trade union for industry and metal workers in Sweden. And climate change will, to a large extent, affect almost all our members. The international trade union movement has long been talking about the need to ensure just transition that is on the same level as increased climate ambition. And we cannot ignore the urgent need to step up our global efforts to reach climate neutrality as soon as possible. Climate change is affecting everyone, but it cannot be that the workforce and the poor will be the first to pay the price. The measures to adapt to climate change will not affect everyone equally, and workers around the globe are at the center of the transition and will be the actors to implement climate ambition throughout their daily work. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'm afraid I couldn't find a better picture for you. This picture is in Swedish, so I will try to explain. But the picture shows Sweden's territorial emissions, and we need to reach by 2045 to reach our climate targets. So in 2017, the Swedish Parliament adopted a proposal on a national climate policy framework for Sweden. The climate policy framework consists of a Climate Act, a national climate targets, and Climate Policy Council. The climate policy framework is the most important climate reform in Sweden's history, and it creates order and stability in climate policy and sets long-term conditions for the business and society. The Climate Act will impose responsibility on the current government and on future governments to pursue a climate policy that is based on the national climate targets and to provide clear feedback on the progress. Sweden now has a long-term climate target and a council that independently reviews climate policy. The reform is a key component of Sweden's efforts to live up to the Paris Agreement. And by 2045, Sweden is to have no net emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and should thereafter achieve negative emissions, which means that activities in the Swedish territory are to be at least 85% lower by 2045 compared to 1990. But Sweden also has an intermediate target that emissions from the domestic transport are to be reduced by at least 70% by 2030 compared to 2010. Another important effort is that the government recently introduced a state green credit guarantee. The guarantee is to be based on technology neutral criteria for major industrial investments that contribute to achieving goals such as climate policy framework. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So I will try to tell you more about the industrial transition in the northern Sweden, Norberton. And Norberton is one of the territories chosen for the Just Transition Fund, and especially the steel industry. And then I will try to tell you a little bit about two huge industrial investments in northern Sweden, in Norberton as well. Norberton represents almost 1/4 of Sweden's total land area, but only 2.5% of the Swedish population is based in Norberton. Norberton has large natural resources such as wood, ore, and hydropower, and the industry in Norberton consists of a few very large plants in the mining industry and steel industry, but also the paper and pulp industry. The region is dependent on the jobs available in these industries, and at the same time, all of these plants will have to adjust their operation for us to achieve climate targets. Sweden is one of Europe's most important mining countries. Together with the steel and metal industry, the mining industry constitutes a large part of the Swedish export industry. IF Metall has almost 6,000 members in the Swedish mining industry. And LKAB is the EU's largest iron ore producer and mines around 80% of all iron ore within the EU. The company was established in 1890 and has been an important cog in Sweden's export industry and industrial development for more than a century. The company has been an important supplier to the European steel industry for the same length of time. The steel industry in Sweden has a very niche-oriented production with an increasing focus on steel that provides environmental benefits from a life cycle perspective. The Swedish steel industry is one of few big employers in Norberton, with almost 16,000 employees in the whole of Sweden, and more than 15,000 of IF Metall's members work in the steel industry. But the steel industry also stands for 1/3 of the industry emissions in Sweden. SSAB has been in the steel industry for more than 140 years and is a highly specialized global steel company. The company has been at the forefront of sustainability and aims to be fossil-free by 2045. Next slide, please. So in Sweden, Norberton, we have 2 big industrial investments with the vision to produce fossil-free steel. Both investments are dependent on a stable electricity system and in need of skilled labor to make the investments possible. The first one is Hybrid, a collaboration between SSAB, LKAB and Vattenfall, electricity company, to develop a fossil-free value chain for iron and steel production using fossil-free electricity and hydrogen. The hybrid technology has the potential to reduce Sweden's total carbon dioxide emissions by at least 10% and may in the future help to reduce emissions from iron and steel production globally. The second investment is H2 Green Steel that was funded in 2020 with the aim to build a large-scale fossil-free steel production in northern Sweden. They are starting from scratch, building a large-scale hydrogen-based company, and by 2024, the company will be in production at the Boden site. And by 2030, the ambition is to produce 5 million tons of fossil-free steel annually. Next slide, please. So just transition, what does it mean? And when we talk about just transition, we talk about the framework that was developed by the trade union movement and ILO to include a range of social interventions needed to secure workers' rights and livelihoods when economies are shifting to sustainable production. A just transition for all towards an environmentally sustainable economy needs to be well managed and contribute to goals of decent work for all, social inclusion and the extinction of poverty. So some jobs will disappear and other jobs will change, but at the same time, new jobs are being created with good opportunities for adjustment and skills development for future jobs. Acceptance can be made for the measures required for companies and societies to be able to switch to a lower climate impact. One of the most important conditions when it comes to the industrial transition is a well-functioning system that provides the right competence needed to be able to act on the potential that lies in being at the forefront of climate change. So in order for us to create new green jobs, industrial companies must be competitive both through and after the big transition that we're facing. In this way, the industry can continue to invest and grow both in Sweden and globally. But for that to happen, we need sustainable industrial policies, and the Just Transition Fund is one example of policies that could make the transition more just for our members. And in the Swedish JTF or Just Transition territorial plan for Norberton, there are 4 kinds of efforts that are planned for. And one of those are competence improvement and retraining that could be very important for our members. And 2 of the most important topics here are efforts made to validate the skills of our members and efforts to map the skills needed in the steel industry. And it is important to coordinate the efforts with our existing educational system so that we can gain from former investments in relation to skills development. Next slide, please. Challenges for the steel industry in Norberton. What we see in Norberton is a new industrialization with thousands of new and green jobs, but there will be a challenge to find enough skilled labor. So the efforts regarding skills development will be of importance, and the companies will have to strengthen their strategic work connected to issues regarding skills. It will be important to attract young people to the mining and steel industry and to make the societies in Norberton appealing to live in. Another big challenge is to make sure that the electricity system can deliver green electricity to competitive prices so that our companies can maintain their position and competitiveness. Today we see rising electricity prices, and the question is if the market can maintain a high level of reliability. And in Sweden, we expect the demand for electricity to double until 2050. One last challenge is the need for more efficient processes of permit and renewed permits. There is a huge debate in Sweden on how we can make this process more efficient, and we need the process to be shorter in terms of time, but also to be more transparent for the companies. Today, we see that companies avoid making changes in their production that could reduce their emissions due to the complicated processes connected to the permits, but also that investments are being placed in other countries so that our members could lose their jobs in the long term. Thank you.
Elika, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. I found that very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have questions about it later, particularly in relation to the shift to low carbon steel and how this you foresee this. But the other issue which struck me very much was the difference in the type of territories we're talking about. I mean, you know, Pittsburgh and Ray's presentation showed this very clearly. Industry was centered in the heart of the city. And that raises a whole set of challenges, but the challenges you're facing are very different. You are in less densely populated areas, and attracting people there becomes a bit of a challenge. So I think that's the first message that I draw from the discussion today. Is just, in spite the heart of the industry is the same, the territorial dimension can be very diverse and may produce specific policy challenges. And that's, I think, a bit of an introduction to Tamara, who has our next presentation. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to engage on this platform. There's a lot of interest in Canada on what Europe is doing with the Just Transitions mechanism. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about some comparative policies, but I'll start off about a little bit about the steel industry in Canada. And Canada has had many industrial transitions. I wouldn't say always necessarily just, but you can think of the collapse of the cod fisheries, the collapse of manufacturing, forestry shifts, and the term just transition really arose in Canada in the 1990s in the province where I am, with the forestry sector changing. Next slide, please. And it has since gained a lot of attention. And before I start, it's important for me to acknowledge that I and my university are on the land of the Lekwungen peoples. And in Canada, a just transition necessarily includes Indigenous peoples as rights holders, not stakeholders. And it's a really important part of the work that's being done today. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about Canada's steel industry and then some lessons from a comparative review of just transition policies, practices, strategies, all of the above from OECD countries. Next slide. So let me just start by saying climate change is top of mind today. My island where I live, Vancouver Island, which is around the size of Belgium, has had catastrophic flooding today, and it's here. And Canada is quite polluting. We have among the highest per capita GHG emissions of any advanced economy, and we've never met our GHG reductions targets. So the industrial sector is really important within that. About 40% of our GHG emissions are from the industrial sector. A large portion of that, over half of that, from the oil and gas sector, and Alberta oil sands in particular. And this is an important sector economically. It's around 11% of nominal GDP and 2% of direct employment. So industrial transitions are in fact central to meeting Canada's climate commitments, and I think we can say that progress has been slow. Next slide, please. So there are, within the steel industry, high hopes to green the industry. This industry employs around 23,000 workers directly and has a value of about 3.8 billion to our economy. I didn't know this before, but doing a bit of research, I understand now that because of where the steel industry is located in Canada, it has relatively low carbon intensity, and that has to do with the energy profile of the provinces where it's located, such as Quebec, where there is hydroelectricity. So that's the case in some provinces, in others not so much. And for those that are in provinces where there is coal-fired production, there is an emphasis on phase out. So in some cases, there's an emphasis on what the industry can become, in places where the energy profile is greener, and in other places a phase out. And so we have really distinct regions in Canada in terms of our energy profiles. There is a net zero 2050 goal set by the steel industry itself, and we are seeing investments in achieving this goal in some places. For instance, investments in research and development. There is an ELYSIS facility in Quebec, which aims to commercialize the world's first zero carbon aluminum smelting technology. And this is an Alcoa and Rio Tinto group collaboration. And it aims to eliminate essentially all direct GHG emissions from the aluminum smelting process, and the federal government has invested in this, and I believe the provincial government there as well. So there are efforts to decarbonize the sector, and also I'd say Industry 4.0 investments to propel this along as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to switch tracks now and just say, what are the instruments we can use to manage a just transition? What are just transition policies? What does this look like? Next slide. And I wanted to ask this question in my research because we have incredibly rich case studies, and I wanted to understand broadly what are the swath of instruments that are being implemented today. So really focusing on what it looks like today. And I can say this is like such a fast moving field that, as soon as you're done the research, I think you almost have to restart it. So what I've done with the research I'll share with you now is just to look at just transition policies in the places and regions that have experienced them. And I've defined this in a certain way. I've looked at places across OECD countries that have had more than a quarter share industrial employment over the past 20 years, which subsequently declined quite significantly. And so this is looking at subregions to identify cases at the NUTS 3 level. And what I find from this analysis is that there are around actually 25 countries, 74 regions, and 130 subregions across OECD that have this profile. Next slide. So this is one way to look at this question. It's by no means the only way. And in fact, in large countries like Canada and the US, this third level, territorial level, doesn't work quite as well as you can see with these maps. But basically, I've classified regions that have transitioned by my definition, those that are remaining high industry, growing industry, or low industry. And I think looking on this map, we have some pretty high industry regions, but because of the size of the territorial scale, the services industry is diluting that. So my threshold maybe was too high for some countries. Next slide. And these are European states where the NUTS 3 level works a little bit better. You can see the transitioned regions in dark blue. Next slide. And finally, here's Korea, Japan, Australia, and Chile as well among our cases, and New Zealand. Next slide. So this is one way to look at things. It's by no means the only way, but what this is a large comparative analysis looking at all of these subregions, scaling up to the region and then to the national level to identify what are the policies and approaches that we've found, and then to try and create a logic of sorting them. And so this is the best sorting I could come up with of the things that we've seen. We've seen climate solutions, which are focusing, of course, on GHG commitments and energy strategies and climate change strategies and mitigation, adaptation, and investment. Workforce development, of course, which is so critical for the Just Transitions agenda, including employment and skill strategies, training, education, and so on. Economic development strategies, different industrial transition commitments, business and tax incentives, and so on. And then the important elements of regional development policy and rural development policy and infrastructure investments that come under regional development. A much less emphasized aspect of these just transition policies is how we can use our social security systems, including temporary financial supports for displaced workers, social insurance, pensions, in fact, and early retirements, which only a few countries really have targeted to certain sectors in transition. Industry 4.0 initiatives were another bundle. And then finally, I have governance in dark blue, because this seems to be the absolutely critical thing. We see that this is a multi-level governance challenge, that there are very different types of territories. How do we involve the stakeholders and right holders, engage communities, not just industries and workers, but communities where these industries take place, and coordinate at the local level and do consultation and public engagement? It's a big question. You know, how can we deliver that? In Canada, we have a good example. We had a coal transition task force that was led by the federal government that has worked in this way and created community hubs to manage the just transition process. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to share some of the gaps identified, looking across all these different countries in places that have experienced a large share of industrial employment, which subsequently declined. The question is, well, what happened in these places? Amongst the instruments that we have seen used, what do we see? And I think that starting off from the climate solutions, and this is a big bundle, that equity considerations within the strategies we've reviewed are commonly absent. And an exception is that we see in a lot of the strategies, these are national and regional, funds to mitigate energy consumption costs for low-income households. You can think, for instance, of Korea. This is their strategy right now. A lot of the other elements of what might be a just transition, the impacts on people and workers and communities, are commonly absent. In terms of workforce development, these are the most common just transition strategies, and they target workers and typically and not communities, and they are not often combined with other initiatives. So I think a thinking there is, how can we we know how to do this, and workforce development strategies have been used very effectively in a lot of states and regions, Canada included. We are quickly able to often mobilize them, but what can this look like together with other policy levers? In terms of economic development, I think that in general, we see a lot of steering and not rowing, and that where you need rapid transformation, that you may need much more interventionist policies and even public sector ownership of assets in some cases. And a key question here is also how to address stranded assets in our shift, which can be highly problematic. We have a lot of stranded assets in Canada of for instance, oil and gas infrastructure. Thousands of wells that are not being decommissioned effectively and that were never considered as we develop that industry. Regional development policies are being branded just transitions to some extent. I think that we're finding this language, if not that term, but the intention behind it, evident in a lot of the places we looked at. But then I think a question is, to what extent are they really engaging with that concept of justice across its deliberative, procedural, and reciprocal connotations? And to some extent thinking, is this just a new kind of industrial policy, or does it really deal with justice? And where are the equity elements? And really looking at the EU as a huge test case here. I think it's exciting what you're doing and what you can achieve, and that the instruments are really effectively designed maybe to deliver on this front. So all eyes on you. And the community level in the regional strategies and plans that we looked at are often absent, but I think that that will change very quickly, I suspect. Finally, just moving on to the others, in terms of the social security system, I think we can see that across the country is studied that it's often underused, and it might be critical for society-wide transformation. We saw under the COVID pandemic that it can be rapidly mobilized. And a question here is also the role of the pension system. So countries like Poland and the United States have had, for instance, coal pensions to transition that industry. And what is the utility of that in other countries and for other industries? The Industry 4.0 investments are really envisioning an economy of the future, and they tend to be branded just transition as a solution, but the links to equity and social justice in our assessment of these policies has been a little bit weak. And finally, the coordination mechanisms are often absent in terms of how we manage the governance processes. They tend to be reactive and ad hoc interventions. That those are quite common, and particularly in Canada, those are common. And it's been a criticism of how our industries have transitioned, that we've come and done community development hubs or workforce development strategies kind of after the fact when that transition is underway. So a big question is how you can identify more proactively. And there's some interesting examples. For instance, New Zealand has a Just Transitions unit that works in the Ministry of Business that tries to proactively identify regions that are going to be undergoing transitions in the future. And they've worked, for instance, with the Taranaki region that has had a large oil and gas sector transition. What can our bureaucracies look like to encourage this? I mean, that's a big public administration question. And I just leave it at that. So I think I'm sharing my research, but I'm sharing a lot of research questions coming out of the research as well. Next slide, please. So that's it in a nutshell, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Tamara, many thanks. That was a great panorama of what's going on. And look at your first slide of kind of mapping the instrument. The question did come to my mind, you know, what is the glue holding this all together? But then you answered the question, which is the governance and the governance structures and the way in which the public actors enable communities and workers and residents to be involved in the process. So that allows us to seg nicely into our last presentation with Sebastian to tell us about the experience in Essen. Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for putting this panel together and this Just Transition platform, and also thank you to the other speakers, to Ray from Pittsburgh. We are already in an exchange with Pittsburgh with a project called Urban Transition Alliance, driven by ICLEI and the MacArthur Foundation since a couple of years. So happy to meet you here, and also thank you to the imports of Sweden from the Green Steel and from Tamara with that great overview. So I will just talk a bit about Essen and the Ruhr region, with having also a look on the regional framework we are working with. So Essen is a city in the heart of Ruhr, and Ruhr region means 5 million people, one of the biggest, third biggest metropolitan regions of Europe. But Essen is in the heart of this 13 cities metropolitan region, which is quite a difference to other centered regions. We are just a more fragmented pre-industrialized area, and so these 5 million people live here because of all this industry. There was not any huge city before. Industry came, coal mining came, people moved here from all over Germany and all over Europe to find jobs, and in 100 of years this whole region was completely industrialized and urbanized. So this transition from rural area to industry was very fast, and the time of industry was, compared to what we are working on now, a very short period, but it left over us a huge job to do. And so the transition of rural region away from coal and steel started already in the 1960s, where we had the peak of population and also the peak of production. And there was a famous word which was changing also the point of view, which was from Willy Brandt. He said, the sky of Ruhr has to become blue again. And so this was also the start of a strong empowerment of livability and health issues, and also of environmental laws and restrictions to air pollution. And already in the 50s, people saw that coal mining will decline and steel production will be more in a global framework than before. So this was a great vision. The sky will become blue again, but also it was envisioned with the decline of industries which have already been in sight. So with the 1960s, there started a huge program on the whole Ruhr region, which implemented universities. We did not have any university at all with a region of 6 to 7 million people at its highest peaks. Not one university was there before 1965. The first university was opened in Bochum, and 72 in Essen and Dortmund. And so this was one very strong driver of the transformation. And today we have 300,000 students in the Ruhr area. That is equal to the numbers of workers in coal mining in 1960. So this shows somehow how this shift has been driven from this side, from the educational side. And today we are the region with the highest density of students and universities in Europe. But remember that all this was brought new to the region, even as the industry before. So the last coal mine closed now 2020, so the transition from coal away was still ongoing, and we had the sulfur coal mine in Essen, which was one of the most productive coal mine of the world. Today is architectural UNESCO World Cultural Heritage, and it's a museum, a park, a conference center, and so this transition is also still visible. So we had this program in the Ruhr area, which was driven by transforming infrastructures, by the idea of keeping identity and transforming places with culture, and to reuse these industrial places where people over generations have spent their time. So this transformation of industrial wastelands to green infrastructure was driven by the needs, but also by a very visionary idea, and became a role model with the Emscher Park. And so we have been in Essen, Green Capital of Europe in 2017. And the jury was especially pointing out that regional approach and also the Essen's approach on transforming these wastelands to a green infrastructure. And this is also including the reconversion of the Emscher River system, maybe you heard of. So the whole northern region of Ruhr area is covered by the Emscher River system with 800 square kilometers. And this river was used as an industrial and urban sewer system, an open sewer system for 100 years to keep this region clean and keep all the wastewater off. But today, this is a nearly finished reconversion. So this whole river system is now renatured and is filled with clean rainwater. And for this whole area, also a new wastewater system has been set up with wastewater treatment, and spaces of this industrial sites have been converted to become green, and parks and cycling ways. We turned these railway lines into cycling lanes and walking paths, and also the maintenance road of these old sewers became a network of green corridors through the whole city and also connecting to the region. So this is the one part of infrastructural change, which is very important and still visible today, and giving us great spaces of freedom and leisure. And the other was the educational part, which just brought us universities and lots of science, and it helped us a lot to shift from the mostly industry based labor from coal mining and steel production to the service sector and to science, and to also implement new innovations and branches in the area. But still today we have steel production in Essen and in the region, and maybe the ThyssenKrupp company is known. It has over 100,000 workers still today, and maybe half of them are in the regional, working on regional sites. Not all of them are in the steel production, because these companies also changed in their branches, which they are delivering different services and different products. In Essen is only based the headquarter of ThyssenKrupp, which has like 3,000 workers. So there's no steel production in our city area, but it is also connected still to a lot of steel production site. And like the Swedish model idea, they are also working on green steel, transform their production to green steel with hydrogen. They already had the first blast furnaces working with hydrogen the last year. So there is also in these companies a strong empowerment of innovation to follow these CO2 pathways, which are now also set up by the German climate law, which is very important. And in Essen, we also have an aluminium smelter in the city area, which is also interesting, because this one aluminium factory is using more electricity than the whole city the population needs altogether. So there is a huge amount on electricity in this transformation process, and we don't have this opportunity to produce all this electricity in the area. So we are dependent, if these production sites will stay, we are dependent on importing electricity, or based on hydrogen. So this hydrogen strategy is at the moment a very popular. So there are lots of programs running, and Essen is also working on a hydrogen strategy. It's already the first papers are already done, and they are defined the pathways and the transition steps which have to be included from transport, from industry, and also how to include this in heating systems and how to connect to regional and also international hydrogen systems. But if we look at this hydrogen concept to empower these industries, we have a relatively long pathway, so that there will be a really impact on the CO2 emission will be all available perhaps like in 2030, so that we have, or 2035, so that we have from now on in the whole discussion on the CO2 and what we also had in Glasgow on several different discussions, is that we still are in the need to deliver renewable energy as much as we can now. So because the whole hydrogen strategy is based on what we can do now. So if we are not able to bring these renewable energies, energy efficiency, and also other integrated concepts for heating and to deliver heat in our urban fabrics, we cannot set up the hydrogen in the same framework. What's maybe interesting, we also have in the EMSHA conversion completely autonomous wastewater treatment plant, which is driven by energy which is delivered through wastewater and windmill. So they have set up an idea how this wastewater can also be used as a resource in the urban area. We have today a new study published by the Wuppertal Institute. It's called Transformation to the Greenest Industrial Region in the World. And it says the consequences of global warming are almost in the news every day, but the highlights and the urgency of reshaping our economy to limit the man-made rise in temperature and to develop sustainability overall. And this poses particular challenges for industrial regions like the Ruhr, but the transformation also offers great opportunities. Green industrial regions can combine economic strength with a high quality of life. And they do also point out what is interesting, that in the Ruhr region today we have a very high potential and already a high level on green jobs, so that we have empowerment of new industries combined with science and this university sector. And they also set up new production sites which are based on technologies developed with these universities. And maybe to sum it up, in the end, we are still dependent on a strong industry in the region, but not as much as like decades before. So we have today like 13% in Essen of people in the labor market working in the industrial sector, and in the whole region it's a bit higher. And maybe compared to the last talk of Tamara, we already had this strong labor market management in the area. We had also this great movement of workers, which was very famous in the Ruhr area. But still, the Ruhr area has a higher unemployment rate than the average in Germany. So we are still in the transformation process. And as I said, the last coal mine just closed 2020, and we are still in the transformation of infrastructures and of large places of old coal mine, now unused coal mine places, which are in the transformation process and city planning process now. So that's maybe the end of my talk, and I'm looking very forward to discuss further how we can set up the future to be green and sustainable, and maybe also very much more circular, which is also a perspective also for steel industry.
So, Sebastian, thank you very, very much indeed. I mean, two things struck me. The first is this notion of a long-term trajectory from the past to the future. I think Ray talked about this a bit as well. But the other aspect, which has been implicit to a lot of what people have presented today, is this notion of system change. That, you know, we have to embed what we're doing not simply as a sectoral initiative, but linked to consumption, linked to the energy sector, linked to urban and territorial planning. First of all, just to say thank you to all of our speakers for presenting so much interesting information and perspectives in such a short time. This gives us an opportunity to have a discussion and to have some questions from the audience. And I have a first question to Ray. I think it came to you first because you spoke first, Ray, but I'd be interested, of course, to hear the other speakers' view on it. And I think this is a very classic policy question, which is, how do you connect what you're doing in terms of infrastructure and urban renewal projects to people? And how do you engage them and ensure that large-scale physical investment and urban renewal initiatives actually benefit the people who are, let's say, have been most affected by the process, but also other issues of exclusion, which I know has been an issue in Pittsburgh?
Well, one way that you address it is in the way that the city has, and this is, I'm talking within the city for the moment, has worked to have revitalize and re-energize neighborhood planning as both a method which empowers people to engage and be in consultation, to put it in a continental or a British term, but also to actually have some, to create a plan which has teeth, which becomes one that's in the official record of the city, which we hadn't had for about 15 or 20 years. So that's been, and that's, I'm talking about places particularly like Hazelwood or now Manchester, which are adjacent to either former industrial sites or heavy industrial sites in Hazelwood, or former more industrial warehousing kind of sites in the case of Manchester, where you try and make sure that the existing community that's there, some of whom worked in the industrial or their parents worked in the industrial sector in those huge sites, they have some kind of stake in this new development. That stake can be through job training programs, programming activities, open spaces, other job opportunities, even residential opportunities, often through affordable housing strategies. So that's one way. I think in the region, there is that type of planning work being done in certain parts of the region. There's sort of these initiatives such as the eco district and initiatives along the Allegheny and other rivers that are like that, sort of sites with sort of river towns, which are facing a challenge now, which is actually some of these river towns are facing a very soft version, but it could be called gentrification in the sense that they're being rediscovered by new populations that were not necessarily the population that was there over the long term historically. And again, it's that type of work to try and make sure that in shaping that and in that new investment, which is happening often from in sort of almost unlikely places, but closer into Pittsburgh, but it is happening, is to try and make sure that that type of work is done as well, in which there's a true community voice in the shaping of it. There's work like that happening also in some of the industrial. More difficult is where there's really a community that's, in some cases deeply alienated from an existing industrial activity, which is one version, depends on where you sit and who you talk to, in places where we still actually have the legacy of steel industry. So, I hate to say it's just sort of consultation, but it is consultation with sort of like, engagement as an active and a growing and increasing in expertise, and also so that when we put out things like this Marshall Plan and so forth, it's like, let's look at what we've been doing and let's build on that and make those stronger and make that a necessary way that you do that type of planning.
Right, thank you. I don't know, Elika, Tamara, or Sebastian, would you like to add something from your perspective on this question, on this issue?
I guess just to say it is kind of the key issue, and I think amongst the different countries and regions that I've looked at in my work, often how we engage at that community level is just not very well defined within governance mechanisms or within the strategies that are trying to manage a just transition, particularly climate strategies. So we have this problem of scale, and I think with the community hubs that we've seen that are typically created to manage a just transition for a specific sector, that's a common strategy. They have tended to focus on workforce development and skills, retraining, and so on, those types of supports, and not the broader question of what community economic development and economic diversification might look like. So yeah, I just thank you for raising that. It's such a key issue. I don't have any particular glowing case studies, in fact.
But this is a difficult bit. I mean, we know this. Sebastian, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, only with a short note on a tool that in Germany is quite popular. It's called the Städtebauförderung. It's a city renewal funding from the state government, and this is connected also to integrated programs. So if we want to, as a city, we want to use this really huge funding program, we have to develop integrated, also socially and infrastructurally integrated programs for parts of the city. And there are some restrictions. We have to deliver some goals to get this funding. And now in the new funding scheme, also the climate adaptation is becoming more and more important, so that there will not be a funding for urban renewal programs from the federal government, which do not recognize social participation and climate adaptation measures. So this is really something the German federal government is also very proud of. This program is still running since some decades, and they also now have a report on it. And they can also implement some new strategies. And the cities and municipalities, they are somehow depending on that programs because they cannot drive all that renewal programs on their own. Especially the rural region is not that powerful what the financial side is. So this is also delivering these social and inclusion aspects. And we are now having a program of this new sites of the old coal mining in the northern Essen region, and this also in this framework we set up also a new program of this integrated urban renewal plan, with which is including the so there are also some industrial areas defined, but also the surrounding neighborhoods are included in this concept.
Right. Thank you very much. Elika, we have a question for you, and this is, I suppose, because of your trade union links, but also with the ILO. And one of the audience would like to know: are you in touch with colleagues outside Europe to discuss the just transition, particularly in relation to steel and other carbon-intensive sectors?
Thank you. Yes, of course we are. It's very important for us to have a dialogue with our colleagues internationally. We have an organization called Industry All, both Industry All Global and Europe, where we meet to discuss issues like the transformation for the steel industry, for example. And I think the challenges are of course very different in the different countries, both in Europe and when we meet to discuss globally. If you compare Germany and Sweden, for example, the challenges are different, even though we are close, and that the countries are quite similar when it comes to business and for example the steel industry.
Right, thank you. I have a question. It was raised a bit, and moving away from the focus from people, but something which is very challenging about ensuring that areas remain attractive to live and work in is dealing with stranded assets. I mean, beyond the economic dimension of stranded assets, you know, there is a big risk, and I was just wondering. Perhaps to hear from Ray and Sebastian about how you dealt with this and how you intend to deal with it in the future.
Well, we have a whole new generation of stranded assets and all those fracking wells. That is another story, but there's a lot of shiny houses and new high schools that were built, and what was really in many ways a very strong economy, and may, depending on global markets, may still actually be returned to being a strong part of the economy. I think it's stranded assets. I mean, you're really talking like a sort of major industrial plant or the infrastructure that supports it when we talk about that. You know, well, one version, and I know it's a limited one, but certainly Germany has the sort of leader in this, is that they transform them into kind of a different type of site. I mean, I realize that sort of sounds like another kind of revitalization strategy, but that is, you know, Kerry Furnace in a very mild way is a transformed site, which was the major works for Carnegie Steel. And as an arts center, as a event center, as a tourism center, et cetera. And it actually is in many ways successful in terms of its reinvention. It's not to scale really in terms of the number of visitors and so forth, but it's part of a larger vision of the region, which is developed, frankly, rather slowly, of its heritage in steel as part of a story to be told, and that becomes part of an employment and education kind of opportunity in and of itself. That's one way that it's been dealt with. Regionally, I think that's why this work needs to be done on the communities left behind, because there's communities that are never going to really be part of that sort of, call it heritage tourism or however you want to define it, and are too far from the sort of economic centers to really become kind of, you know, bedroom communities for those centers or not. And so how to deal with those is some of the work that we're going to be doing with this kind of communities left behind. And I don't have a perfect answer for that, because there are brownfield sites that won't be redeveloped. The ones in the center of Pittsburgh, they made sense to be developed. Ones that are well outside, it's going to be a much greater challenge. There is I think we're still working to find, you know, how that's really going to be addressed.
Right. Thank you, Sebastian. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, we have this. great idea of this IBA-EMSCHA park was to transfer this really poisoned and dirty area of EMSCHA. The whole EMSCHA River area was just a wasteland belt, and they found the phrase for it to call it the EMSCHA Park. And this was really an unbelievable provocation, because this was just a huge wasteland, which was no park at all. So it was poisoned, and the EMSCHA River was a stinky open sewer, and people living around that, they could not stay outside in the summer because it was stinking all over. And today, this is a really fantastic area where people can cycle, mountain bike, because these dump hills of the coal mining have been regreened, and so they have been aware that it's not able to remove it all, so they have just regreened it. But these places today have a very high biodiversity and a very high power of recreation, and the people living around it. And the EMSCHA River conversion, that's maybe also interesting, is program which was run by the sewer regional sewer authority. So, and it was completely financed through the sewer fees on that. Also, the renaturing programs are part of this rainwater and wastewater separation system. So this was like 30 years of great success, but still there are not so many new jobs in this area. So we have this transformation from the sectors and from knowledge, but still people live in these parts of the city, and the poorer people still live in the northern parts of the region, and there is less education and there is less green. EMSCHA area is great to be, but it's still less green than in the south, and people still have higher unemployment rates and more migrants living there. So there is still a job left to do. We are still not finished. But what I think is now the chance, if we have to continue a transformation in the aspect of climate adaptation, there is a completely new idea of how we can transform streets and public spaces to become climate resilient. And we have now also a regional program which is called the Climate Resilient Region, which is also building up on the EMSCHA idea, but connecting to this climate change and rainwater and green strategies. So there is a way how we can continue transformation of all these areas, but what I said, there's still a job to do, and we're working on it.
Many thanks. I don't know, Tamara, in your survey of all of these different approaches, did you come across any interesting instruments to deal with stranded assets, brownfield sites?
Yeah.
Any interesting fiscal mechanisms?
Sure, some. I mean, they exist. The scope of that challenge is just astonishing, though, in so many places. Think, for instance, of Western Macedonia. And the planning on those assets, that's a coal region, like, is just so huge. It's just hard to wrap one's head around. And I think what really struck me, actually, amongst all of the different regional development plans that we looked at, was the absence of coordination with the spatial planning system and with land management plans. That seemed very weak. And I'm quite interested in how the spatial plans are being coordinated under the Just Transition mechanism with alongside the national plans. I think that's a really, really critical instrument that we have seen quite neglected to deal with some of these large assets.
Right. Well, thank you very much. And I think I mean, once again, it's this question of integration that we come back. I mean, we're talking about land use and the different policies that can potentially impact on this, and clearly, you know, depending on the level of the public authorities, you have different possibilities. I mean, one of the advantages you have in a place like Pittsburgh or Essen is that you have a relatively concentrated city authority who can deal with this. In other areas, it can be much more complex, and these questions of multi-level governance become important. And as Sebastian, I think, hinted at, the possibility of an outside actor like the federal government, or in the case of the US, the state or even the federal level, to come in with resources can be very important in pushing things in different directions. Anyway, we've come to the end of the questions and answer session. I'd like to hand over now quickly to Vladimir to do a quick roundup of his takeaways from the session before I close it. Vladimir.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, and thank you, colleagues, for participating in the session today. I don't want to keep you for too long. Just a few key words that I took away from the discussion today. And I wanted to highlight two things in particular. I think we've heard what I was particularly struck by. We've heard all fascinating examples from the US, from Canada, and the EU, which many of them share a lot of similarities. For example, if we look at Pittsburgh and Essen, we've heard in great detail from Ray and from Sebastian how cities that were previously, heavily based on coal or they were basically heavy industrial areas, are redefining itself and turning from, let's say, wastelands to really a modern city of the 21st century. What I found, particularly in the case of Pittsburgh, also quite interesting, was really this shift from coal to fracking, to carbon, to another fossil fuel, and how this is progressing, while Pittsburgh is also obviously completely phasing out and focusing on other sectors such as the health sector. We've seen there's a lot of commonalities here, but there's also differences, such as, for example, we don't have fracking in Europe at this scale. For Canada, from the Tamara's contribution, I thought it was really interesting the way she spoke about the overall governance framework and the policy measures that we have, because today, as I've heard earlier in some of the sessions, people say, just transition is a buzzword. Everybody uses it today, but what does it actually mean? So I think talking about this governance and what kind of policy measures we actually have in place, how does this relate to spatial planning, for example, I think is really helpful, and something we certainly should also look more into the future when we talk about just transition. And finally, for Sweden, again, I thought that the issues when you look at a region that is not maybe close to a big city or a capital city, what is interesting here is the questions of how you retain the workers, how you make it attractive to the local population to stay here, how do you ensure that you have access to stable electricity, which is necessary for you to keep on producing, to transition to a cleaner form as we decarbonize our economies and the whole sector, and how do you do all of this while making sure that your production continues, as we've heard that from Elika, that this is still this is a key sector for Sweden's economy, and very much part of the export of Sweden. What I think here, that what we have all together, what we've heard today, is really the wealth of the different experiences, and the need for such an exchange between of a transatlantic exchange between the EU, the US, and Canada. So this should not be a one-off, but rather we should continue this dialogue, and certainly in my view. But the second point that I wanted to highlight is why we are also discussing this. We are discussing this. We've just had the COP 26, and we know all about the urgency to decarbonize our economies in the North America as well as in the EU. But also, and maybe here I would add another dimension to of course decarbonize worldwide, which is, as you know, a whole another huge challenge. And I wanted to here mention the example, if we are probably familiar with the agreement that has been signed by the US, by the EU, UK, France, and Germany to support the transition away from coal. So to support the just transition in the energy sector in South Africa, and with a sum of $8.5 billion. So this has been announced at the COP by the respective leaders, and it will be a very interesting process and a study that could hopefully serve as a model, in particular here focusing on the coal sector, but hopefully in the future also in other carbon-intensive regions, perhaps in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. And as we've all are aware of the importance of coal and transitioning away from coal, and how this has been also, how this sort of somewhat derailed the COP at the last at the closing stage and extended the negotiations. And here really the combined knowledge of EU, the US, but surely also of Canada for the future will be vital, together with the financing that might be provided here. And of course we will be working together, I mean, as DG Klima, but also with colleagues of course in DG Regio, DG Energy, DG Employment. We will be working on having a bit more structured process, so on these exchanges, so that these discussions can continue. So again, I would maybe leave it here to basically thank everyone for today, and to hope that this is a start of a process where we'll continue these exchanges in 2022 and beyond. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you, Vladimir, for those conclusions. I can only agree with you that the discussion together was for me, it was interesting to see how natural it was. That even if so far away from each other, that the issues that we're trying to deal with in different contexts, there is still plenty to learn from each other. So I think we need to continue this work, and I hope that we'll be able to encourage these types of exchanges and cooperation in the context of this platform. I just want to finish by thanking our four speakers, thanking Sebastian, Tamara, Elika, and Ray for their excellent presentations. I think they really were. I could have listened to you for much longer, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity in the future to do so. So a big thank you to you. Thank you to the team organizing it as well. And just finish by wishing you all an excellent evening. Thank you.